Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Office of Research and Innovation this afternoon. The Office of Research and Innovation's mission is to foster the advancement of cutting-edge research discoveries and technology at the University of Texas at Dallas. With our departmental resources, we provide faculty, staff, and students with a variety of specialized information and training to help efficiently navigate funding opportunities. During today's training, Making Lemonade Out of Lemons, Insights and Tips for Your Proposal Resubmissions, Hanover Grants Consultant, Melissa Cornish will discuss the best approach to proposal resubmission and share key strategies for success. Melissa offers Hanover Research higher education clients with grant reviews, writing support, and project design services. Her experiences in grant writing, proposal refinement, and resubmission span programs and grants to the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, U.S. Department of Defense, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and a number of private foundations. Prior to her joining Hanover, Melissa served as a project leader manager at a large academic medical center and other research-intensive institution where she identified and managed research collaborations and provided extensive business development support to the form of grant writing and proposal budget department, strategic planning, program development, and communications and marketing. Time spent with her children, trying a new recipe in the kitchen, or sitting on the beach signify her favorite activities. She received a Master of Science in Public Health with a concentration in health policy from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and she completed her Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology and Interdisciplinary Studies from Emory University. I am Tiffany Willoughby, Research Education Programs and Outreach Manager in the Office of Research and Innovation at the University of Texas at Dallas. I will serve as the session moderator. Now let's get started. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I appreciate that introduction. And thank you all for joining us today. Today we're going to turn our attention, just as Tiffany highlighted, to what happens after you've submitted your proposal and learn that you aren't being selected for funding. Many grant proposals do not get funded on the first try, as we all well know. Revising a proposal for resubmission is often the key to being successful. So how do we figure out how to make take our lemons and make some lemonade? Let's get started. But before we do, a few housekeeping items that I need to highlight. Today's presentation will be about 60 minutes long and will include a few minutes for Q&A and wrap up. I suggest that you maybe consider taking out a piece of paper, jotting down some notes along the way, and also note that the slides along with the recording of today's session will become available on UTD's Office of Research and Innovation webpage, and will remain there for an extended period of time, so you're all welcome to go back and check those out. So just for the sake of some background in terms of who I am, where I'm coming from, who's Hanover Research, I just wanted to highlight here that Hanover Research is a private firm that offers custom research and analytics through a business model that helps our clients across the corporate, education, and healthcare sectors in the United States. As part of our content arm, we have a team of grants consultants providing support to a number of academic institutions and healthcare partners. As grants consultants, we are tasked with a number of jobs, including providing some very customized proposal reviews and revisions, supporting programmatic planning with proposal production, and helping our clients sort of align their strategic priorities with funding opportunities that make sense for them across a breadth of prospective sponsor types. Today, we are proud to say that we've supported over $650 million in wins of external funding by our clients across federal, state, and private grant makers. Our team is comprised of about 14 grants consultants and senior grants consultants, along with some research analysts and content directors. We have a wonderful team, and I am happy to be here. Just again, for some background, my name is Melissa Cornish. I've been with the team now for about 4 years. I've supported over $15 million in wins, and sort of my focus areas are related to the National Institutes of Health, as well as the National Science Foundation, but I have much experience in a number of other federal sponsors and private foundations. Okay, so let's get started. Why are we here today? Let's just go through an overview of today's topics. We will cover why rejection is practical. What does it really say, meaning the summary statement or reviewer's feedback, how to respond, what's next, and I will end with some resources to provide you with a number of things to consider going forward. Our learning objectives are to understand the value of a proposal rejection, to determine if a proposal resubmission is appropriate, and then to appreciate how different federal sponsors view proposal resubmissions, since some sponsors do not all sort of act the same in terms of accepting those. So before we talk about revising and resubmitting, let's get through the toughest part first. Rejection. We know it hurts, but it's certainly a fact of life for most. And in terms of understanding why rejection is practical, we have to acknowledge that it's not so bad, because most proposals are actually rejected on the first time they're submitted. Public data estimates somewhere between 75 and 90% of submitted proposals are actually declined. And we know from many that getting funding after the first try is actually pretty uncommon, and that rejection itself is a huge part of the grant seeking process. So what about proposal rejection that it is versus that it is not? It's certainly a multidimensional opportunity to learn a number of things, and some of these are listed here. It's a chance for us to learn from our mistakes. It's the opportunity to understand someone else's perspective, aka the reviewers, and see what they are, see that they are not always wrong, or that they bring sort of a different hat to the review process. It's a chance to know the rules and then apply them to your advantage. And it's certainly an opportunity to develop your determination and your strategies, both short and long term, for being successful. However, what proposal rejection is not, and this is important to remember and keep in the back of your mind, proposal rejection is not a rejection of your interests or your life's work. And it might not even be a rejection of the quality of the proposed research project itself or the research design. It is certainly complex, but most definitely should be considered quite useful. So rejection often leads to positive results, and here I've provided some current data on both NIH numbers as well as NSF numbers in terms of original submissions for the research project grant type. So we see here from FY 2020, over 19% of the applications received were awarded, and that's out of almost 52,000 competing applications, compared to nearly 32% that were actually submitted as a resubmission. So they had already been declined, and then they had been improved and resubmitted as that A1 type of grant application. And so the second time around, almost a third of them were actually successful. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind for a little bit later on. And then the NSF is slightly different in the sense that the NSF does not actually capture the number of applications that are submitted as resubmissions, because all of their applications are actually deemed as new. However, we know from the numbers that they received almost 43,000 proposals in FY 2020 and made only about 12,000 awards. So that's about a 28% success rate. Some of those might have been sort of improved upon and resubmitted, and I use that word loosely, as I just noted. And so it's sort of the takeaway here is just to note that it's extremely competitive, and while the federal sponsors get a significant number of applications, they certainly are not funding more than a sort of quarter to a third of them. So resubmissions have a higher success rate, and we'll talk a little bit about how we know this or why we know this and how to help position ourselves for those resubmissions that are more responsive going forward. But first, you need to make some important considerations before you actually dive in and undertake the revision process. So we need to note the differences between federal versus foundation type sponsors. Each one has their own set of resubmission rules. And we also need to acknowledge that just because you might get review summaries back, they might not be considered, or they should not be considered, all inclusive. Just because someone or a group of peer reviewers reviewed an application in such a way, it doesn't mean that they found every single flaw and or every single strength of that particular proposal application. We also want to point out that resubmission often improves your likelihood of success. However, it does not guarantee it. And making a decision to revise and resubmit is certainly no small undertaking and requires a number of considerations, some of which we'll talk through here in a few minutes. But before we do that, we need to sort of dive in and dissect what the review says. So let's say you submitted your proposal and approximately 6 to 8 months later, you've got the sad news, you found out that your proposal is not being funded. And then what? So you're looking at this review summary that you hopefully got back. If you were submitting your application to a federal sponsor, you got some sort of written documentation back from the group of reviewers. But you want to start to tease it apart and start to read it closely, sort of read between the lines, figure out if the reviews were generally positive, do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses that the group of reviewers pointed out, what types of issues were identified by the reviewers, was the proposal rejected for a significant number of reasons, are there consistencies among the comments? And then after you've read it, I think this is an important key and something that we maybe get distracted by when we get this type of feedback. We want to read it, but then we want to take a break and walk away, maybe give it a couple of days, and then go back and reread it with a fresh pair of eyes, and maybe a different sort of attitude, a little bit more openness. That initial read might be disheartening and discouraging, but come back to it a couple of days later, because then you're going to want to ask yourself sort of a series of important questions. And by thinking about this, digesting it, you certainly want to consider some important questions to ask in terms of determining whether or not you should become a re-applicant, so to speak. So the listing here, not exhaustive, but hopefully thought-provoking and intended to serve as a guide in making that go versus no-go decision as to whether you should invest the time in resubmitting your declined application or if you should turn your attention and investment of energy elsewhere. So consider questions such as, were the reviewers right? Can you see their point? What did the reviewers generally agree upon? Were there any outlier comments? Were the reviewers wrong? Did your proposal simply not articulate what you had hoped? Did they misinterpret some information? Did they overlook some pertinent detail that you had expected them to see? Can the reviewer concerns be rectified? And overall, what was the tone, or what is the tone of the review? Is it generally positive and supportive? What does your gut tell you? And so you want to certainly think about these types of questions and evaluate them very critically, and potentially discuss them with your collaborators, with those who were involved on the original submission. But the reality of the reviews really is that reviewers are human too, and they certainly can disagree with each other. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, they could have even overlooked some pertinent details. A poor panel fit, meaning the group that reviewed your proposal, could have led to an unhelpful review of what maybe others would have considered a pretty strong proposal. Negative reviews may not necessarily cover all of the proposal weaknesses. This points back to that comment about proposal reviews not necessarily being all-inclusive. Maybe a different group of reviewers would have found some different weaknesses within the proposal itself. But then what? So what are you supposed to do with all of this information and thoughts and uncertainties about how to expend your energy? And we know that your time is very precious. Well, first and foremost, you certainly want to get another objective opinion, whether that's with the group who you originally submitted the proposal with, or whether it's from a trusted colleague or a peer, or maybe a new collaborator who you're thinking about submitting the application with going forward. So you most definitely, you need to ask yourself about your availability of time, your commitment, your willingness to undertake this type of an endeavor. It's by no small means an undertaking. You asking yourself questions like, can I reasonably revise the proposal and address all of the identified weaknesses before the application window closes? Do you still have the time and the bandwidth, given all of your other responsibilities, to dedicate to such an undertaking? Are there other considerations that you need to weigh into this type of decision, knowing that this is probably going to cost you a significant number of hours to resubmit and go through all of the application packaging again? Are there other changes to your circumstances? Have you had a change in roles? Have you added to your teaching commitments? Have you gotten awarded another grant that you've already committed to with collaborators or partners in your department? So then, in addition to evaluating all of these details from your own perspective, you also have to potentially reassess how committed is your institution to this particular effort. Have priorities changed? Has the institution's strategic plan changed? Is this no longer an important area of investment? And then decide if the project really is still of interest to you, to yourself, to your partners, and is it still relevant? Has enough time passed between the time that you originally developed the first application, submitted it, waited for the review period to end? Quite possibly 12 months has passed by now. Has new data been published? Have there been new findings that no longer make your work as current as it once was? So all very important variables to consider in making your decision as to whether or not you should invest the time and pursue that resubmission approach. I think ultimately, if there is an opportunity to reach out to the program officer, the person who manages that particular mechanism or program within the center or directorate that you were submitting to, there is so much value in making contact with that individual, requesting a brief call or meeting, talking through the summary statement, talking to them about your options going forward, and asking for their guidance on how they would handle the next step as with regard to a resubmission or a brand new submission, or maybe considering a completely different opportunity because there might be a new program out there. So I urge you to prioritize making contact when there is a program officer to talk to, because it's so important to do that type of cultivating and outreach for a number of reasons, but they're sort of the ones closest to the fold and who can really provide you with some very relevant and valuable insight and answer some of those questions that maybe no one else can. So we are going to turn our attention here for just a moment and talk through a sample review and resubmission plans from the perspective of the NIH. But first, I'm going to pause and ask Tiffany if there's any questions that have popped up in the chat box.
Thank you for checking in with me. There is indeed a question in the queue, and the question is as follows. Are there any resources out there for reviewing your application prior to submitting?
There are lots of resources out there prior to submitting, and I would urge you to think about individuals who you trust, both from a professional perspective as well as from sort of a lay literate perspective, who can be a clean, fresh pair of eyes in terms of looking at the actual application package, as well as resources that might be available to you internally with the University of Texas at Dallas. And I can also point to a couple that I do share at the end of the presentation with links to proposal development sites, in addition to making recommendations for a website like the National Institutes of Health that actually offers a number of sample types of applications so that you can see those that have actually been funded, obviously redacted in terms of private information, but that you can look to and point to if you're looking for actual samples of specific types of research applications. So when we get towards the end of the webinar, I'll be sure to highlight those as well. But thank you for your question. So let's turn our attention to the National Institutes of Health, obviously a heavy hitter when it comes to funding biomedical sciences, and one of the largest federal sponsor in terms of number of applications, as well as dollars invested in research funding. So in terms of the policy itself, the NIH allows only one resubmission of an original application, and I include on this slide the semantics that the NIH uses. So an original application being an A0, and one resubmission is an A1. The subsequent resubmission, that A1 application, should reflect how the field has changed over the interim between the time of submission, including any new preliminary data, relevant literature, letters of reference, and so on and so forth. Resubmissions must be submitted within 37 months of the original application, the original A0, and a resubmission must not be submitted until the summary statement of the A0 has actually been received. So there's a few exclusions to this, but generally this NIH resubmission policy applies to almost all applications submitted to grant and cooperative agreement funding opportunities that do allow resubmissions. And so on this next slide, when we are considering sort of the scoring rubric that the NIH uses and the criterion that all reviewers are subjected to use for the sake of consistency and continuity across programs, this slide highlights the main criterion which are used across, shown here across the top of the slide, as the scored review criteria, and they are applicable to each application submitted for any particular mechanism. So really, what does this slide mean? So after your proposal has been submitted and undergone sort of a standard check for completeness, it then gets assigned to a study section, also known as the scientific review group. And this is the group that's charged with evaluating each application for both scientific and technical merit under the NIH peer review system. And so each individual peer reviewer is asked to evaluate your application on the 5 criterion at the top, which are significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. And so then each one assigns a preliminary score to each of these 5 areas. And the preliminary scores, as shown in the table, are sort of organized from low to high, lowest being the best, highest being the lowest or the poorest. And then depending upon the total score that's accumulated, those scores are used to determine which applications will be discussed in full at the meeting. And this goes on to mean more when we get to the summary statement, but ultimately a final impact score is produced by each committee member and then calculated to determine what the final impact score would be. And that is the score that is reported on the summary statement. And so here, this is sort of a rough breakdown of a high score being somewhere between 1 and 3, a medium between 4 and 6, and then low 7 to 9. And you'll see from the descriptor and the additional guidance, if you are scoring a 1, you have scored exceptionally well. There's really no weaknesses identified. Compared to scoring a 9, the reviewers are struggling to find many strengths in the application and have identified numerous major weaknesses. So something to sort of keep in mind when we look to this next slide in terms of what those scores tally up to be over a sort of 100-point scale to determine what that final impact score looks like. So to start off though, what the numbers tell us, if you receive a summary statement back that says your proposal was not discussed, or ND, this means that no impact score was actually calculated, and it means that the proposal was probably ranked at the bottom half of the so-called application pile, and therefore is not being recommended for further consideration. Odds are if it's received an ND, then the reviewers deemed it as being insignificant or lacking in sort of any substantial merit, or maybe it has some significant ethical problems associated with it. But if it is scored an impact score of anywhere from 10 to 99, then that means that the first half of the pile, wherever that first half falls, that those will have been discussed and have a potential for being funded, but wherever they fall in that stack, the program staff of the NIH then sort of make their recommendations and proceed with advising the institute director on what funding decisions should be made based on the review of the top half of that pile. And so there are obviously a number of factors that need to be considered in the decision-making process for a possible NIH resubmission. These are obviously the impact score alone, but not totally by itself. And this table here, I do note, is a guide and certainly not a rule. We have some sort of rough cuts in terms of if you score under a 46, then that might be a good rule of thumb to resubmit. A new submission might be over the 46, and if it was not discussed at all, then you certainly want to revisit other options and reconsider the direction of investing your time in a new proposal, maybe to a new program. And so the second, third, and fourth columns here offer some criteria in terms of sort of cutoffs that one might use in taking a rejected proposal, turning it into a resubmission, or doing something overall different with it. Again, this is a guide, certainly not a rule, but just to give you some of that additional insight into the NIH process, as it could be a little daunting when you first receive your first summary statement. But for the sake of today's presentation and providing some examples, I've included here an excerpt of what one reviewer's comments might look like. And you can certainly see that they share both strengths and weaknesses. Again, there were those 5 criterion that I listed a few minutes ago. Here we have the approach, and this individual reviewer provided a significant number of strengths related to the approach of the application. These are all very promising. Of course, looking at these sort of in a silo needs to be weighed carefully, because you want to also consider what the rest of the reviewer's summary statements also say. But this is just one for the sake of presenting what this looks like. Here, though, the reviewer also pointed out the weaknesses, and obviously their job is to review the application. It's probably not going to be just a summary statement of strengths, but we want to know what those weaknesses are so that we can then help decipher whether or not they're fixable or they're fatal, and if there was some benefit in pursuing that resubmission route. So you'll see here that the reviewer specifically identified weaknesses with the study design in terms of there not being any control group identified. The reviewer is asking how the study will assess whether the changes observed are not time trends. And then they also noted that the proposal was lacking detail about the curriculum content. Certainly considerations that could be given in terms of deciding that these types of changes are actually fixable. And then they thought that the environment was quite good and that there weren't any weaknesses with the environment. So in terms of following the rules for the NIH Resubmission Policy, this is sort of one of the NIH's unique attributes of submitting a resubmission, in that it requires a very succinctly written single-page introduction. And this is a must. It has to be included if you decide to pursue that A1, and it has to be strictly adhered to so that all of the weaknesses that were raised in the summary statement have actually been addressed. There is an opportunity to change the application title. That's not a big deal. A PI or program director could even be added or removed. Identifying individual changes in the text is a thing of the past. So in the old days, individuals actually had to mark up the full body of the research strategy and show what changes were made from the first version to the new version. But this is absolutely not needed and has since been changed in policy, and the text should not be marked up. So that's kind of good news. And then obviously using the most current forms. We know that the NIH is sort of notorious for changing forms on a 6 to 12 month basis. And we certainly want to make sure that when you're resubmitting an application, you're using the most current forms, because something like that would deem you unresponsive, and we wouldn't want you to go through all of that effort just to figure out that you used the wrong versions. And then providing substantive justification. If you disagree with something that a reviewer said, the introduction letter is your chance to diplomatically identify it and respond as to why or why not you are changing something at the recommendation of the reviewer, and why you disagree with good justification. So some tips here for writing an actual one-page introduction are going to be shown actually in practice here on the next slide, but you ultimately can identify the title and proposal number of your original submission. You want to take a chance to just thank the reviewers for their time, emphasize the highlights of the strengths and positive comments that they shared on the original summary statement. And then you want to be sure that you address all of the critiques that have been provided. And this is sort of where the challenge comes in when you have only a single page to do so. But your most important concerns, the concerns that have been deemed most important by the reviewers should receive the most space in your response. You want to sort of organize the responses in such a way so that they make sense and they refer to a specific section of your proposal. And obviously being brief and direct, cognizant of the page limit, is critical when you have such little space to work with. And then using tips such as an active voice, first person plural, and avoiding too much apologizing are sort of good practices to get in the habit of. If you aren't sure whether to include your responses, here again, this is sort of a regular theme now that you're going to hear me say a few times in this proposal, is to ask the program officer, or sometimes referred to as scientific director, but that individual will be able to provide you with insight most likely, and might even be willing to look over some of the changes that you're proposing in light of the original summary statement that you received. And then most certainly ask a trusted colleague, maybe someone who's actually collaborated with you on the revisions to the new proposal. Ask that individual to read the response and provide you with some real sort of, hard feedback so that you can make that response as appealing and appropriate as possible. So here, for the sake of a sample, this would be the start of an introduction page that one might write for an NIH application. So you'll see here, and I did lift this from an old application resubmission, but this is a resubmission of add the number, add the title, briefly summarize, and then we'll move on to say quickly, we'd like to thank the reviewers for their useful feedback. Their comments were really helpful, etc. And then here you're highlighting the positives that they identified in that summary statement before you move into addressing all of those major critiques that they had, We've closely considered the reviewer's critiques and provide a synopsis of our changes. And then you'll see here at the very bottom, study design is sort of how this introduction page kicks it off, pointing out that reviewer 1 noted such and such, and as a result, we have revised the design. And so this would be one way that you might group together those types of critiques to address sort of in a more comprehensive way how your proposal actually has made those changes in the body of the narrative. So it is important to respond in such a way that you are acknowledging the weakness that they've identified, and that you've then summarized how you fixed it. And I would urge you, just sort of as a reminder, that if you are making changes, if you are saying you're making changes in a document like an introduction page, then you most certainly need to make sure those changes carry throughout the entire proposal package, so that it looks like the entire package aligns with what you are originally proposing. So here is a critique where reviewer 1 recommended the addition of a 6-month follow-up study to ascertain if the effect persists after the structured intervention. So there's a few ways here of how to respond. The first, we chose not to conduct a follow-up study, would be considered quite defensive, and the tone isn't quite right. I'm going to go back to this. This is why we did this. You know, it's kind of short and sweet and blunt. However, the second response would be probably considered more appropriate, softer, agreeable, much more thoughtful, you know, so that you're pointing out that the reviewer raises a good point. Therefore, we've added, et cetera, et cetera. And so rather than being defensive, you know, be thoughtful, be considerate, be kind. You know, carefully word your acknowledgement that there was a problem and this is how you're going to alleviate it. And then the second example, the reviewer missed information. Well, it's quite possible. Reviewers are human too. Odds are your application is not the only one that the reviewer was looking at. Very well could have been the bottom of a large pile. So rather than saying, well, okay, I acknowledge that the reviewer missed information, and here I'm going to tell you in my response in that introduction letter, we already included it. So I'm imagining here a scenario where maybe there's a case control study with certain variables that were going to be used as your matching criteria, but the reviewer missed it. The reviewer did not realize that you had already included age as a matching criteria and asked you to do so in their comments in terms of what an original weakness was identified as. So rather than just sort of regurgitating that you missed it and it was there, shame on you, instead that softer, we apologize for our lack of clarity, we will include it as a matching criteria, and this is where it could be found. Again, being defensive or having a tone that's just off is not going to sort of win you points, but being thoughtful and considerate in your response is important. So in terms of more generally speaking, if reviewers were critical of the significance of your proposal, then you might consider how you can emphasize how your project addresses a key gap in knowledge or how it aligns with the mission of maybe that institute or center. If they were critical of the methods, there's a number of ways to improve upon those, whether you have new preliminary findings to report, maybe an update of your methods, maybe a new method, maybe you are outlining your approach a little bit differently or explaining your design decisions. And certainly identifying what challenges and alternative approaches might be for concerns that reviewers might have had with regards to some of those methods. If they are critical of your experience or that experience of your team, then you certainly want to take advantage of components of the application like the bio-sketch to sort of justify, promote, identify a productivity that maybe you've had since you submitted the original application. Maybe you've considered adding a new member to your team who brings some capability or specialized skill set that you didn't have previously. Maybe you've added the element of an advisory board. A lot of first-time applicants or early stage investigators consider how to build in a small advisory board to sort of add that element of consulting and mentorship to the overall project design, and that might be viewed very favorably. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago about ensuring that the introduction page is cogent and well written, it also goes with saying the same about the research strategy and all components of the application. But overall presentation really does mean a lot. And looking at the package of the application from both sort of a graphic design standpoint, a readability standpoint, ensuring that the application has been proofread and spell checked, and maybe you can hire or identify someone who can serve as your fresh pair of eyes to make sure that all those sort of smaller errors and typos have been caught long before you go and submit the second time around. So I think after all is said and done, it is important to remember that while that summary statement from the original submission is rich with information and important to acknowledge and use to your advantage, you certainly don't want to obsess over those prior critiques. You want to make the changes and then focus on looking ahead rather than looking back. So just briefly, we're going to highlight the National Science Foundation since it handles so-called resubmissions differently in that it does not require any sort of cover page or introduction letter. For the sake of understanding the review process, NSF reviewers are reflecting on both the intellectual merit and the broader impacts of the particular proposal that they are reviewing. So what is the potential for your project to actually advance knowledge and understanding within the particular field? And then in terms of broader impacts, what results or what impact will this project have if funded to benefit society and advance some societal outcome or improved goal? So the graphic on the the graphic on the right-hand side just sort of goes through stepwise process of the phases of the application submission process with the NSF through phase 1, and then phase 2 really being the process where the application is reviewed, it's peer reviewed, and then a recommendation is made to the program officer, and then the division director ultimately has the final decision making. But for the sake of the NSF perspective on resubmissions, this is really interesting. So a declined proposal may be resubmitted to the National Science Foundation, but it's always considered a new submission and has to go through a substantial revision. And so by this, I mean that while they don't have any specific requirements for special documentation, it is extremely necessary that the NSF program officer, if that individual was to go back and look at your original submission, would see that the new application has a substantive number of changes and is not simply just a sort of regurgitation of the original submission. So all are treated as new. A resubmitted proposal that has not taken into account the feedback provided by the original summary statement and is then resubmitted will potentially be returned without review. And so you certainly don't want to risk, all of that effort and time that you've put into submitting a new proposal and then just find out that you hadn't actually made enough changes. And then the other important point here, it's sort of a contrast to the NIH, is that in many cases, programs within the NSF are actually ask investigators to wait at least 12 months. So there's this sort of moratorium period before resubmitting the proposal again. And just as I said with the NIH, it's so important to build that relationship with a program officer and reach out to that individual to ask if they have any input or suggestions in terms of your next steps. They will likely have seen the summary statement and can be reminded of what it said, maybe talk about opportunities for submitting your new idea, and maybe they might have recommendations as to how to pursue a new program or some different avenue that you hadn't considered before. So for the sake of being sort of thorough here, one foundation is one foundation. They're certainly not all the same, but I wanted to touch on foundations sort of as a collective. Unfortunately, not all foundations provide feedback. They certainly can't guarantee that they'll provide reviewer comments and or even a reason for rejection for the original submission, but it's still important to take that as a growing or a growth opportunity for you to look at the foundation again, revisit its priorities, maybe since several months presumably have passed since you actually submitted the application, that you can go back and see where the application lacked or considerations that you might have to make in terms of submitting a new version of it. Foundations may not have program officers to speak with. Some might have an email inbox which you could direct your questions to. Again, each foundation is quite different, but certainly using the declination of the original application as an opportunity to revisit the proposal certainly can be used to your advantage, and potentially as an opportunity to engage new collaborators, to go back and look at that original and make suggestions of how you might consider future directions, and involve others to help you do so. I think the key takeaway to foundations really is an opportunity to cultivate a relationship, not only after the process, but both before and during. If you are to receive an email that just simply says, "We're so sorry, we're not funding you at this point in time," then take the time to write back a note of thanks, thanking them for their time, for the opportunity to potentially work for them, and then use it as an opportunity to sort of build your own database and keep track of your losses as well as your wins, so that you can start to create your own long-term grant seeking strategy, and maybe go back to that foundation in a few months and revisit what their applications are looking for, what their priorities are, because you never know when you might end up pursuing them again and or crossing paths with that foundation in some other avenue. So sort of doing your diligence and tracking that information could pay dividends in the future. So in terms of fatal flaws are those flaws where you've figured out after doing your homework that your original submission is just not worthy of being resubmitted and investing all of that time. Maybe your original proposed research is no longer important, nor is it innovative. Maybe someone sort of beat you to the punch and already published on it. Maybe your hypothesis, the original one, is no longer supported by your pilot data or others' work. Maybe your lit review was just incomplete or out of date. There's all of these reasons why some might consider it's just not worth resubmitting. Maybe you need to go back to the drawing board altogether. And maybe your proposed methods aren't suitable anymore. So lots of considerations in terms of both a summary statement that provides you hopefully with a lot of rich content and thought-provoking questions, and maybe even some sort of scoring rubric that highlights or hints at whether or not the proposal is actually worthy of being resubmitted. So what's next? So if, for sake of argument and presentation today, if you do decide to pursue a resubmission, you certainly want to make sure that all pieces of the application puzzle are up to date and put together, and you've taken the time to sort of cross all your T's and dot all your I's in terms of updating bio sketches, making sure that if you had letters of support, you're not submitting the original ones, but you've actually gone back out and asked for them again. You're using the right forms and new templates. Maybe this time around you've recruited outside help. don't obsess over those prior critiques, but use them to build on. But if you choose a different path, those could be maybe a new study section. You figured out from your first rodeo that it was not being reviewed by the right group. Maybe there's a different funding opportunity that would be even more receptive to your idea. Maybe there's a completely different funder that you just never knew about before, and you realized after talking to colleagues and the sponsor themselves that maybe that would be a better fit. And so you're going to forego a resubmission, but maybe repurpose what you've already started and turn it into a brand new application. Or maybe it's time for you just to acknowledge that you need to move on. You certainly invested a lot of time in this project and you don't want to just throw it all out the window, but you've learned from it and it's time to go pursue some other element of your research or some new and different idea that resulted as a result of some pilot study. And that's okay too. And lastly, maybe it's time to design a pilot project to sort of figure out that feasibility so that you can sell that part of the project to the funder on the next foray, rather than trying to sell it all at once, but to be convincing and to show the next batch of reviewers that you can in fact undertake what you promised to undertake. So in terms of sort of receiving that declination, it's important to remember that you need to expect it. Grants rarely get funded from their initial submission. So really start planning the minute you submit your first proposal to make that next resubmission even better. And then you need to accept it. Reviewers are always right, even when they aren't. They will always find flaws. That's what they've been recruited to do. And they will point out the imperfections in what you propose and how you propose it, because without them, then we wouldn't be able to identify what those weaknesses are and how to make them better. And then finally, perfect it. Develop a plan, successfully address their concerns, be thorough and thoughtful, and also conscious of your priorities and your time, because if your interest is no longer there in that project or that program, then the reviewers the next time around are certainly going to sense that, because if you're not excited about it, then odds are they won't be excited about it either. So learn from the process as much as you can from each grant seeking experience. Think about it as sort of relationship cultivation, both with your peers, with prospective collaborators, certainly with program officers and scientific directors, most definitely with foundation groups. Identify and understand what your resources are, both internally within your institution as well as those that are publicly available, and there's lots. And remember that grants are not always funded the first time around, and that the expectation for a resubmission really should be built in, because we know time and again that it is a highly competitive, extremely iterative process. And so just in terms of closing for today, I wanted to point out a number of resources, and hopefully this helps the individual who asked the question a little while ago. But without a doubt, you always want to turn to the funder websites. Make sure that you're checking their priorities, their programs, their rules and guidelines. We know that some of these details change without any forewarning, and we always want to go back and double check, especially when you're looking at a resubmission for a program that was released maybe several years ago and has been reissued time and again. You always want to go back and check to make sure that that program is still actually active and hasn't been sort of sunsetted unknowingly. I've had that happen a couple of times with people who have made the investment, and it has been devastating to go find out after all those changes and plans for a resubmission have been made that the program actually expired. That is just heartbreaking. So here's some federal tools. The NIH report site is phenomenal. If you are interested in the NIH, I urge you to go here and query in any sort of using any text that might be of interest to you to find other programs that have been funded already, to just poke around the NIH, to find program officers who might be very relevant for you to talk with, as well as other projects that might be relevant. And then this beta testing site is a new addition to the page for publications associated with the awards that the NIH has made. And then last but not least, Hanover has a fantastic and growing grants training center, and I urge you to go visit here if you haven't ever been on this website before. We have a number of resources, both with regard to calendars, some templates, PowerPoint presentations, as well as public webinars that our team does on a monthly basis. And here's just a snapshot of our grants calendar that gets put out every 6 weeks or so. And one of the researchers on our team puts this together, and this one is for early career research, and might be of great interest, but sort of covers a whole host of upcoming funding opportunities, just to give you a visual sense of what's coming down the pipeline between now and next August. Certainly not exhaustive, but a lot of the heavy hitters are included on this screenshot. And at that, I am going to pause and ask Tiffany if there are any questions that I can take in the remaining few minutes that we have.
Thank you. There was one question that occurred a little earlier in your presentation, and the individual is asking if some of the charts you shared were available on a website. And the charts that I believe they were referring to were related to the NIH Resubmission Policy. So maybe around slide 17, 18.
Those are gleaned from public information that is on the NIH website. It would be a table that we put together for the sake of the presentation, but gleaned from a number of different resources that is publicly available.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Another question that we have is, do you have recommendations, tips or trips? Tips and tricks to share with the audience, especially for people who are submitting their applications for the first time, or for people who are reapplying. And we know you shared a lot of those tips today, and we appreciate it. And I especially like the jargon you use: expect it, accept it, and perfect it. But how about for those first timers? What types of tips and tricks do you have to share with them?
So the biggest and sort of the one that rises to the top is start early and ask questions, ask for help. So starting early in terms of, if you think you have a great idea and you're looking to find external funding opportunities, start early, use some of the resources here that I've shared. There's plenty more out there, and sort of start planning or mocking up what your own grant development calendar is going to look like. So you have a great idea, you think you found a funding opportunity that you want to pursue, look ahead to when it's actually due, and then work back from that date, giving yourself several months, ideally, to plan for it and to write it, to have drafts of it so that you can share it for feedback, building in all those sort of elements of development, drafting, requesting feedback, talking to a program officer. So that is most important. And then if you are also sort of first timer at this, or just getting started, start collecting some of those funding opportunities that are of interest to you, and start building your own sort of mini database so that you can keep track of certain ones in terms of deadlines and links, and make sure that you have the most current information so that you can start plotting your own course. Because just sort of as soon as you start working on one, there might be another one coming down the pipeline that you're also planning for several months from now. So it's certainly iterative, but time is of the essence, and giving yourself plenty of lead time to develop something that is comprehensive and thoughtful and thoughtfully packaged sort of will show and will be very obvious to reviewers that that you put plenty of time into developing your ideas.
Well, Melissa, thank you so very much for sharing all of this valuable information with our attendees today. In conclusion, if you have been rejected or your proposal has been rejected, make sure that you self-reflect, perhaps contact collaborators or your program officer to review and discuss options, as remember, they offer relevant insights. Registration and so much more can be found on the Office of Research and Innovation webpage. Please visit research.utdallas.edu. Thank you and have a nice afternoon.